Welcome back. You're watching Roundtable, and we are with Mr. Satis Arnold, and we are speaking about climate change and basically adaptability and issues around that. So, Satis, a very interesting point you made was that how we can look at the climate change in terms of a market failure, where people actually don't pay for their consequences directly, and that accounts to negative externalities which justify state intervention and government intervention. So there's a clear case for the governments to intervene and actually change policy. And you were also referring to a global sort of anti climate change movement that sort of denies the effect of climate change. And in this light, you also referred to Sri Lanka's President's Mahinda Chintana policy documents, where they're referring to the concept of intergenerational equity as a positive aspect. So in the same context, if we can go on to how Sri Lanka can make use of the adaptation capacities that you speak about to formulate the strategies that Sri Lanka will need in the near future, what can you say to that?
I think a great thing we could do is recognizing that the climate issue is an issue of greatest concern to the young people. As I said, I think before, the people who are now in middle age and older, they will be mostly gone by the time the climate problem begins to bite hard. But the young people who are here today and their children, they will be facing this problem at the prime of their life. So what can we do about young people? Well, I think one of the great things we could do is to educate them. So I would say a really important priority would be for us to develop a whole set of curricula for the various issues of climate that will be of interest to primary school children, secondary school children, technical education institutes, university undergraduate level education, and adult education. At all levels of education, develop a whole series of curricula focusing on the relationship between climate change, climate adaptation, and the various other disciplines that are taught in the schools and institutes and universities. If we could do that, then we would create the next several generations of young Sri Lankans who are climate smart.
So you are saying the importance of embedding the concept of as to why we need to worry about climate change to the curricula. So why do we need to worry about climate change? How can you embed that into the curriculum? Can you discuss that concept as to why we should worry about climate change?
Sure. I think, they need to get a basic understanding of what climate change is, and even primary school children can be taught some of these concepts.
Yeah, and you were referring to the carbon emissions. And
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So we can start with the fact that carbon level in the atmosphere is the key determinant of the temperature, the average temperature. And then if the average temperature rises, as it has in the last 200 years, above the global mean of 15, it's actually risen about 0.8 of a degree Celsius in the last 100 years or whatever, then that's beginning to now disrupt climate. The higher temperature, for example, tends to retain more moisture in the air. That means less rainfall. So that is the kind of way temperature changes climate. Warmer temperature, warmer air can hold more moisture in the air, invisible water vapor, and therefore less precipitation, less rainfall. That's just one mechanism, but there are many others. There are disruptions to stable climate, storm systems, tornadoes, all these kinds of things, dry periods, El Niños, which are prolonged droughts. All these things become more and more variable, violent storms, storm surges from the sea, and they're all related to the warming of the planet. And so this is something children can be taught for a start, but then they can be taught what that does to agriculture, what it does to living creatures. The prediction is that if temperature rises 2 degrees this century, somewhere between 15 and 40% of species will become extinct. Now, if the temperature rises 4 degrees Celsius it would be catastrophically bad for all life on Earth. So these are things that children can be taught, and then they can be taught what can we do about it. How can we live smarter? How can we develop shelter and food that can cope with some warming?
So in that context, Satis, now if you look at the community-based adaptation policies, now children is one thing, education is one thing, but there are communities right now in Sri Lanka, and there has to be something that takes place now, and empowering communities to engage in adaptation might be a way to go about. So how should maybe the government and other stakeholders empower communities to take some ownership and actually adapt to policies and be stakeholders in sustainability?
I think that's an excellent concept, because people on the land, I mean, Sri Lanka is a very distributed, rural, decentralized population, and people out there in farming communities, agricultural communities, fisheries communities, and so on. These people, they know the land, they know the environment, and with a little bit of help, they will learn to adapt to the new realities. For example, they could be given simple tools for micro irrigation to manage to grow the same crops with less water, but they need little money. So maybe we need some small loan schemes, and the government could intervene by making some very low interest loans available so that farmers can buy this kind of equipment and get them ready in the dry zone to do the same crops or even more cropping with reduced water. And they could be given better seed varieties that are more drought resistant and so on. So there are so many, and we could have educational programs. Technology is now everywhere. So we could have village centers where there are TV screens, where educational programs, information is made available, discussions, because communities like to discuss these issues and come to their own solutions. You know, they don't want to be told all the time what to do. But if you encourage them, germinate ideas, they may come up with solutions that we haven't thought about.
And Satis, you said you were also the director of the Sustainability Development Movement in the Curtin University. So how can you look at the Australian experience? Because we see there's so many bushfires sometimes. So there's a lot of as a remedy, there's reforestation, and there is also rainwater harvesting for the acute shortage of water. So reforestation and rainwater harvesting in Australia are very successful case studies when it comes to dealing with climate change. So how can we as Sri Lanka sort of learn from that experience? Because though we have water, we also know that there is acute shortage of water, and sometimes if we have water, we can make use of water for different purposes. But if we can make the maximum use of rainwater harvesting in a more strategic and methodical way, maybe we can retain our resources more and use it to greater use. How can we learn from Australia?
I mean, that's an interesting question. The contexts are quite different. Most of the Australian population lives hugging the coastline in the southern part of the continent. So south of Brisbane, from Brisbane south on the east coast, all the way down around, and then a tiny bit in the west coast at around Perth. North of Australia is mostly empty, except for a relatively small city like Darwin. And all the heavy rain like Sri Lanka has only comes in the north. So most of the Australian experience is in a different sort of climate setting. And in fact, Australia is the most climate threatened developed country in the world. If you really want to see the horrors of climate change, you have to actually see the extreme latitudes like the Arctic rim, where the permafrost is beginning to melt and buildings are beginning to sink, or you have to come to Australia and see the devastation that wildfire brings. We had an extreme fire event on the 7th of February last year in Victoria near Melbourne, and 200 people lost their lives.